What's unfolding right now between Donald Trump and Beijing could reshape the global balance of power, and almost no one is talking about it the way it should be. Three explosive flashpoints are now tied together in a single equation: Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and Taiwan. And what if China now holds the key to cornering Washington without firing a single shot? Let's get straight to the core of it. Right now, three major pressure zones are beginning to synchronize, and that's what changes everything. First zone, the Middle East with Iran. Tehran is no longer just in a defensive posture. The regime is testing red lines. Between nuclear advancements, military signaling, and indirect attacks through regional proxies, the message is clear. Iran wants to show it can destabilize the entire Gulf whenever it chooses. And at the center of that strategy lies a critical choke point: the Strait of Hormuz. It looks small on a map, but it's massive in reality. Every day, millions of barrels of oil pass through it. If that strait is blocked, even partially, the consequences are immediate. Energy prices surge, global markets react, and political pressure skyrockets. And Iran knows it perfectly. Second zone, Asia with Taiwan. This is an even more explosive fault line. For Beijing, Taiwan is non-negotiable. It's about sovereignty, national unity, and political legitimacy. As a result, China has been increasing military drills around the island, air incursions, and naval demonstrations. Each move is calibrated to send a message: we can act whenever we decide to. Meanwhile, the United States maintains strategic support for Taiwan without fully recognizing it diplomatically. It's an extremely fragile balance. Third element, and this is the key point: these two crises are no longer separate. In the past, the Iranian issue and the Taiwan question could be managed independently. Today, they are indirectly but deeply connected. Why? Because behind both theaters lies the same global rivalry: Washington versus Beijing. And in that rivalry, every tension becomes leverage. A crisis in the Gulf can weaken Western economies. An escalation around Taiwan can stretch U.S. military resources. And the more these crises evolve in parallel, the more they limit America's room to maneuver. That's the real context. This is no longer a sequence of regional crises. This is a synchronized pressure buildup, where each front reinforces the other, and where a single spark could trigger something far larger. This is where things become truly complicated, and where the real trap emerges. On paper, the United States remains the world's leading military power. It has the capacity to intervene, deter, and sanction. But in reality, it's caught in a situation where every option carries immediate and often uncontrollable consequences. Let's start with Iran. If Donald Trump chooses to escalate pressure through stronger sanctions, military signaling, or even targeted strikes, Iran's response is predictable. Tehran won't necessarily respond head-on at first. It will activate its regional network, maritime disruptions, pressure on oil infrastructure, and most importantly, leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. And at that point, the issue becomes global. Because even a partial disruption of Hormuz doesn't just affect the US. It hits Europe, Asia, global markets. Prices surge, economies react, and Washington is quickly seen as responsible for the escalation. So here's the first constraint: acting against Iran risks triggering a global economic shock. Now, the second front, Taiwan. If the US strengthens its support, increased military presence, political backing, arms deliveries, China sees this as crossing a red line. But Beijing doesn't need to respond with immediate war. It can act asymmetrically. Economic pressure, calibrated military maneuvers, gradual encirclement of Taiwan, or a controlled escalation that forces the US to heavily commit its military resources in Asia. And this is where both crises intersect, because the US cannot fully commit to both fronts simultaneously without exposing itself. Focus on the Middle East, and Asia weakens. Focus on Taiwan, and Iran gains room to act. It becomes a balancing act, but one that is growing increasingly unstable. And at the center of this dynamic, one actor observes and adjusts: China. Beijing doesn't even need to directly intervene in the Iran file. Its strategic relationship with Tehran is enough. China is a key economic partner for Iran. It helps bypass sanctions, sustains the regime, and extends its strategic endurance. In other words, the more pressure Washington puts on Iran, the more Tehran can lean on Beijing. And the more tensions rise around Taiwan, the more China can indirectly use the Iranian lever to stretch U.S. attention. That's the trap. A system where every American decision unintentionally strengthens its adversaries, and where inaction is just as risky, because doing nothing allows the balance of power to slowly shift in favor of those playing the long game. So, Donald Trump, or Washington more broadly, faces a dilemma with no easy way out: act and risk escalation, wait and risk losing control. And in this kind of environment, history shows one thing: major crises often begin with miscalculations. This is probably the most underestimated factor in the entire equation, because unlike the traditional image of direct confrontation, China is not necessarily seeking a head on clash with the United States. It's doing something far more effective. It moves slowly, methodically, and most importantly, it lets others expose themselves. Take its position regarding Iran. Officially, Beijing calls for stability, dialogue, and de escalation. But in reality, China has become a vital economic partner for Tehran. It buys Iranian oil, invests in infrastructure, and provides a lifeline despite Western sanctions. Which means one simple thing: as long as China maintains that support, Iran can endure and continue applying pressure on the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, Beijing holds indirect influence over one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. At the same time, on the other front, China is hardening its stance on Taiwan. But again, no open war. Instead, a step-by-step escalation. More frequent military drills, regular airspace incursions, constant pressure designed to wear down Taiwan's defenses, while testing American reactions. It's a strategy of erosion. No sudden shock, but a continuous buildup that's difficult to counter without triggering escalation yourself. And this is where China's approach becomes particularly powerful, because it operates on two timelines. In the short term, it lets the U.S. deal with urgent, unpredictable crises like those involving Iran. In the long term, it steadily builds its position around Taiwan. The result? Washington is constantly reacting. Beijing remains in control of the initiative. Even more subtle, China doesn't need formal coordination between these fronts. Their simultaneous existence is enough. A crisis in the Gulf diverts U.S. attention. Tensions around Taiwan force military redeployments. And while the U.S. juggles these pressures, China strengthens its economic, diplomatic, and military position. This is a war of attrition, without a declared war. And in this type of confrontation, victory doesn't necessarily go to the strongest military power. It goes to the one who controls the tempo. Right now, China is setting that tempo. What we're witnessing is not just another geopolitical crisis. It's a turning point. One of those rare moments when multiple tensions across different regions begin to align, creating the conditions for a major shift. Today, the United States is no longer the only power setting the pace. Donald Trump, or more broadly Washington, is in an uncomfortable position. Every decision becomes a gamble. Strongly backing Taiwan risks escalating tensions with China. Cracking down on Iran risks immediate instability in the Strait of Hormuz, with global economic consequences. And the real danger isn't just in major decisions. It's in the accumulation of smaller, poorly calibrated ones. One extra military deployment, one misinterpreted statement, one delayed reaction. In this kind of environment, crises don't always start with intent, but with miscalculation. And that's exactly what makes this moment so volatile. Because on the other side, China moves without urgency. China doesn't need a sudden rupture. It can wait. Observe. Let tensions rise elsewhere, while strengthening its own position. And if this dynamic continues, one scenario becomes increasingly plausible: a gradual shift in the global center of gravity. Not necessarily open war, but a slow, steady loss of influence. Almost invisible in the short term, but massive over time. That's the real stakes. This is not just about Iran, Hormuz, or Taiwan individually. This is about a global system being reshaped. The real question is no longer just who will react, but who is redefining the rules of the game. And more importantly, can the United States still reverse this dynamic? Or is the shift already underway?